I'm Laura Bennett, 35 years old, and on the night that should have been filled with celebration for my little sister, I learned just how wrong I'd been about the people I loved most. The ballroom glowed with soft gold lights, the sound of champagne flutes clinking through the chatter. My mother's laughter rose above the noise like a polished bell. Only this time the words that followed cut sharper than any glass. "Laura is just so hopeless sometimes," she said, her voice light but sure. The room erupted with chuckles. Someone called out, "Here's to relatives with deep pockets," and the laughter grew louder, spilling across the tables. I stood frozen, a smile nailed to my face, my pulse pounding behind it. In that moment, I stopped being a daughter, a sister, a friend, and became the family fool who paid for everyone else's happiness. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt small in a room full of people who were supposed to love you. I wasn't born into money or privilege. I grew up in a working-class suburb of Columbus, Ohio, where every dollar stretched thin and every act of kindness was expected to circle back someday. My parents raised us to believe family was everything, that loyalty mattered more than fairness, that love meant sacrifice. I took that lesson to heart more than anyone. When I landed my first real job after college, I used my signing bonus to help my parents pay off their old minivan. When my sister Chloe started college, I co-signed her first apartment lease. I never questioned it. That was just what you did when you were the responsible one. I was the steady older daughter, the one who never caused trouble, never said no, never asked for help. Life moved on. I married young a man named Mark, who worked in logistics, and for a while we had what everyone called a comfortable life. We bought a small house out in Fairfield County, 3 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, and a stretch of land I thought we'd grow into. But comfort can turn hollow. After 8 years of polite dinners and silent weekends, Mark and I parted ways. There were no shouting matches or betrayals, just an emptiness that couldn't be fixed. We divided everything down the middle, except for the country house. That was the one thing neither of us could agree on, so by default it became mine. I didn't want it. The place felt haunted by what-ifs. I planned to sell it, start fresh, and buy a condo closer to my job downtown. When I mentioned that plan at Sunday dinner, my mother's fork froze halfway to her mouth. "Sell the Bennett house," she gasped, as if I'd suggested selling our family itself. My father frowned, and Chloe reached across the table with that practiced sweetness she'd perfected since high school. "Laura, you can't. Think of all the holidays we could have there. It could be our family retreat." Their words wrapped around me like silk, soft and binding. I hesitated, and in that hesitation, they saw their chance. The next week, I signed the mortgage for my city apartment instead of paying it outright. I handed my mother a spare set of keys for emergencies, and she smiled like I'd given her a crown jewel. Within months, that house turned into a revolving door. My parents spent long weekends there, calling it their little getaway. Chloe and her boyfriend Evan used it for date nights and romantic escapes. My aunt and uncle visited whenever they wanted a break from town life. Each time I drove out, I found the place a little messier, empty wine bottles in the kitchen, footprints on the porch, laundry piled up in the guest room. Still, I told myself it was fine. Family mattered more than inconvenience. They'd raised me to give, so I kept giving. During the holidays, I was the one cooking and cleaning, while the others lounged with their drinks, laughing like it all belonged to them. When my mother's friends complimented her on the house, she'd beam as if she'd built it herself. My father nodded proudly. No one mentioned the mortgage payments that came out of my account every month. I spent weekdays in the city working late, and weekends in that same house hosting people who barely noticed how tired I looked. Sometimes as I stood at the kitchen sink scrubbing plates, I'd catch my reflection in the window, hair pulled back, smile practiced, and wonder if they saw me at all. I convinced myself it was worth it, that their happiness was my reward. But the truth had already begun to rot beneath the surface, and soon it would break open. The night of Chloe's engagement party was supposed to be joyful. She looked radiant under the lights, Evan beaming beside her, everyone toasting their future. I stood off to the side, champagne in hand, proud and content, until I heard my mother's voice. The way she said my name, half laughing, half mocking, made something inside me twist. Her words sliced through the air like a whisper meant to wound. The laughter that followed told me she wasn't alone. I realized then that all the generosity I'd called love was nothing more than permission for them to use me. I didn't confront anyone that night. I smiled through the humiliation, shook hands, and pretended nothing had happened. But when the music faded and the guests drifted home, I drove back to my apartment in silence, their laughter echoing like a cruel refrain. I didn't know it yet, but the quiet that filled my car on that drive would be the last moment I ever spent as their obedient daughter. Something had cracked, and soon that fracture would become a storm. I drove home from the engagement party in a long, careful silence, the kind that keeps your hands steady on the wheel and your face steady in the mirror. The city lights blurred along the highway, and the quiet in my apartment felt like it had been waiting for me. I set my shoes by the door, turned off the kitchen light, and stood in the dark, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. Sleep came late. In the morning, I made coffee and sat with an old habit I'd learned as a girl in Ohio. When you don't know what to say, you keep going, you keep showing up, and you wait for the right moment to speak. That moment had felt far away a few years earlier when I signed the divorce papers and kept the country house by default. The place had good bones and a deep porch that wrapped around like an embrace, but I didn't have a reason to hold on to it. I told my mother at a Sunday dinner that I planned to pay off a few things and move closer to work. The table went still in a way that felt bigger than surprise. "Sell our little haven," she said, blinking at me as if I'd mispronounced a family name. My father glanced at her, then at his plate, and set down his fork as though the decision had already been made somewhere else. Chloe reached for my hand with that easy sweetness she had always carried into a room. "Laura, we could make memories there," she said, her smile soft, her voice careful not to push. "Holidays, cookouts, birthdays, all of us together." My mother folded the picture in around us with practiced grace. "Imagine a big Thanksgiving," she said, the cousins out on the lawn, the fireplace going. "Selling would be such a shame." I looked from one face to another and felt the old pull of that word we'd been taught like a prayer. Family. Loyalty even when inconvenient. Sacrifice even when it stung. I didn't argue. I told them I'd think about it, and by the next week I knew thinking had already turned into a decision. I took the mortgage on my apartment instead of paying it off. I brought a spare set of keys to my parents' house and laid them on the counter by the fruit bowl. My mother kissed my cheek, and my father said, "Good choice," like he was confirming a measurement. For a while, the house felt like it belonged to all of us in the best way. My parents drove out on Fridays and sent photos of sunsets over the field. Chloe and Evan posted little snapshots of coffee on the deck. The first time I went out after one of those weekends, I found a half-empty bottle of wine, a blanket on the back of the couch, and a note on the counter that read, "Best weekend. Left you a pie." I washed the glasses, folded the blanket, and put the pie in the fridge. As the months turned into seasons, the routine grew. Friday afternoons brought a text from my mother, "Heading out to the house, we'll tidy up before we leave." Saturday nights brought a photo from Chloe, her legs tucked under her on the porch, the string lights glowing, Evan's arm draped around her shoulders. Sunday evenings brought the small, steady work of a place that had been lived in by people who were not staying. I wiped up ring marks on the kitchen table. I swept the grit off the mudroom floor. I changed sheets and folded towels, and I reminded myself that generosity is a habit that keeps a family together. Holidays made the house feel full in a way that could have been beautiful if it had been shared more evenly. On Thanksgiving, I rose before dawn to prep the turkey and chop the vegetables. By mid-morning, Aunt Donna and Uncle Frank were at the kitchen island debating cranberry sauce, and my mother floated between rooms with a glass of white wine and an approving nod for every candle I lit. My father and Frank carried the television out to the sunroom so they wouldn't miss the game, and Chloe stood beside me, tasting the gravy and declaring it perfect. After dinner, the living room filled with soft music and dozing uncles. I stood in the kitchen, rinsing dishes, as my mother laughed with Donna about how nice it was to get away to a place like this. Christmas meant I strung the lights myself and hauled a tree into the living room while Chloe and Evan posted a photo of the two of them hanging the first ornament. I didn't mind at first. It felt like part of my role, the job I could do with my hands, that made the house feel warm for the people I loved. But there were moments when the balance slid, and I felt it. My mother would greet her friends at the door and gesture toward the mantel. "Isn't it lovely," she'd say, as if the house belonged to the idea of us rather than to the person paying the note each month. I said nothing. I swept the porch after everyone left and took out an extra bag of trash because the bin in the garage was always full after holidays. Spring brought barbecues on the back patio and piles of shoes in the front hall. Chloe and Evan liked to invite friends for long afternoons that stretched into evening, and the house became the place everyone wanted to be. I'd arrive on Sundays to clean up and find a forgotten sweater on the banister, a stray earring in the upstairs bathroom, and a sticky ring where a glass had sat too long on the coffee table. I placed the earring on the windowsill and folded the sweater into a neat square. I ran a smooth cloth across the wood grain until it gleamed again. Some weekends, my parents extended their stay. "We'll head back Monday," my mother would text, followed by a winking face. "Don't worry, we'll strip the beds." I changed the linens anyway. I figured they were tired, and it was easier for me to drive out after work than to ask questions they would brush off. I stocked the pantry because the list on the fridge always had the same words scrawled across it: coffee, paper towels, olive oil. The delivery people learned the route so well, they waved when they saw my car. It felt oddly tender and strangely lonely at the same time. The first time Evan's parents came, it was a pleasant, polite afternoon. Carolyn walked through the house as if she were in a model home and said the dining room had great light for a family meal. Walter stood on the porch and admired the view. "This is a slice of heaven," he said, patting the railing. "You all must love having this place." I nodded and brought out lemonade. When he asked whether it was far from the city for me, I said the drive wasn't bad. He smiled and told me I was lucky. I set the glasses down and thought about the mortgage statement that had landed in my inbox that morning. By summer, the house had its own rhythm that didn't include me unless work slowed down or I made room for it. The week after the 4th of July, I drove out on a Monday evening to find the grill left open and a neat row of sparklers lined along the porch rail. The air smelled faintly of smoke and meat. A box of string lights sat on the kitchen table with a note from Chloe that read, "Keep these up, they make it magical." I stood there with my keys in my hand and listened to the cicadas. I put the lights away and wiped a mark off the refrigerator door where a magnet had scraped the surface. Small requests crept in as naturally as weeds. My mother asked if I could call the plumber about a slow-draining sink, then told Aunt Donna she'd handled it. Chloe asked if she could borrow the house for a long weekend and whether I could stock the guest bath for her friend who was visiting from out of town. I agreed more often than I declined because that was easier and kinder. When I said no, the air shifted in a way that made the room feel smaller. "Oh," my mother would say, a hand fluttering to her chest. "We just thought it would be simpler." The implication did the work for her. I would call back later and change my answer. None of this felt like a single moment of harm. It felt like a tide that came in so slowly you didn't notice your feet were no longer touching the bottom. I measured my days by what the house needed and what people expected of it. I learned which brand of coffee my father preferred and kept it in the pantry. I learned to recognize the perfume that lingered in the hallway after my mother had left. I learned to fold Chloe's throw blankets into the exact shapes that fit her baskets. When I visited with friends, I found myself checking coasters under their glasses without thinking. I had become the one who made sure the place stayed welcoming for everyone else. There were good moments scattered through that year. A quiet Saturday morning when I read on the porch with nothing scheduled. An early autumn evening when the wind moved through the trees and a pair of deer stepped out at the edge of the field. I held those small gifts the way you hold an old quilt carefully and with gratitude. But underneath the balance kept shifting inch by inch. People came and went full of easy laughter, and I carried the work that made their ease possible. When my mother tossed off a comment like, "We're so grateful we have a family place," the words landed with a weight I didn't name. As Chloe and Evan's engagement drew nearer, the house grew busier. There were weekends when I didn't go out at all because it was filled with people I barely knew. I walked into my apartment on those Sundays and set my keys on the counter, trying to decide whether to feel relieved or left out. I always chose relief. It made the next week simpler. Still, there were evenings when I stood by my window and looked at the city below, and I wondered when I had started to live around other people's plans. The week they announced the engagement, my mother floated the idea that felt inevitable. Wouldn't the house be perfect for a celebration, she said, as if the thought had just occurred to her. Chloe's eyes lit up, and Evan grinned wide. "It's where we've made so many memories," Chloe added, already picturing the lights, the music, the long table in the yard. I said I'd think about it and pulled the spare linens from the closet anyway. My mother sent a link to a caterer before I'd replied. "Just options," she wrote with a winking face and 3 hearts. I do not remember the exact day I realized I was the last one consulted about the place I paid for. It arrived like certain truths do, quietly on the heels of a small request that should have been easy. My mother texted to ask if she could give the code to a friend from church who wanted to see the hydrangeas by the fence. I told her I'd be out of town. She said it would be quick. I didn't answer for an hour. When I finally replied no, she sent a thumbs up and didn't call me for the rest of the day. It was a tiny thing, and yet it stuck like a splinter that wouldn't surface. I kept moving, because that was what I knew. I worked. I paid the bills. I made room for other people's plans. The house stood there steady and beautiful, carrying more laughter than I ever heard returned in my direction. And then, one late Friday, a meeting got canceled, and I found myself with an evening I hadn't expected. I thought about the porch under those string lights and the way a box of pastries can soften any gathering. I picked up a selection from my favorite bakery and started the familiar drive, the box warm on my lap, the road opening in front of me like a promise. I told myself a surprise would be a kindness. I told myself it would feel good to arrive with something sweet in my hands. I didn't know that by the end of that night, the tide would turn and I would finally hear what had been said in rooms I never entered at the right moment. By the time I reached the edge of town, the night sky had deepened into that kind of quiet black that only exists away from city lights. I slowed when I turned onto the gravel drive. Every window of the country house glowed. For a moment I smiled, picturing the laughter inside, the way my mother would be holding court near the fire, while Chloe and Evan floated from guest to guest. I carried the bakery box carefully as I stepped onto the porch, ready to surprise them. Laughter spilled through the door before I even touched the handle. It wasn't the warm kind that draws you in. It was loud and carefree, the sound of people who felt safe enough to speak freely. I eased the door open, expecting someone to notice me. No one did. My mother's voice cut through the chatter, light and confident. "Laura is just so incredibly naive," she said. The room erupted. A chair scraped, someone clinked a glass, and Aunt Donna's laugh rose above the rest. "She's generous to a fault," my mother continued, "but bless her heart, she doesn't have a clue." My pulse stumbled. I stood half hidden in the entryway, the pastry box trembling in my hands. My father chimed in with a grin I could hear in his tone. "Remember when she almost sold this place? We told her how much it meant to the family, and she bought it hook, line, and sinker." The room burst again with laughter. I heard Aunt Donna say, "She's too good to be true. I told her I needed dental work last year, $2,000, and she wired it without a question. I used it for new furniture instead." My stomach turned. Uncle Frank joined in, his voice booming. "I told her I needed car repairs. She gave me $1,500. Bought myself a new outboard motor instead." Someone said, "That's nothing compared to Chloe." My sister's voice rang out cheerful and proud. "Oh, she always bails me out. I just tell her I'm short on rent or behind on a payment, and she sends whatever I ask for. 800 here, 1,000 there. It's almost too easy." Laughter shook the walls again, followed by my mother's clear, delighted voice. "It's like having our own family bank, no paperwork, no questions, and she never asks for anything back." A man's voice I recognized as Walter Parker's joined in light with amusement. "Every family should have one like that." Glasses clinked, and my mother said, "Here's to relatives with money and no sense." The sound blurred. I don't remember setting the pastries down, only that I found myself outside again, standing by my car, the night pressing in close. The laughter carried faintly through the open windows as I started the engine. I drove without thinking, hands clenched on the wheel, headlights carving long beams through the dark. By the time I reached the city, my throat ached from the effort of holding everything in. I sat on my couch until dawn. The boxes from the bakery sat untouched on the counter. When the first light hit the window, I realized I hadn't moved. The words kept looping through my mind. Our family bank too easy, no sense. I had built my life around keeping everyone comfortable, around believing that generosity was its own reward. That morning, all of it looked like a different shape entirely. The next few days passed in a blur of routine. I went to work, answered emails, joined meetings, smiled when needed. The world kept moving while something inside me began to still. I wanted to call my mother and ask her why, to ask if the laughter had felt worth it. But every draft of a message ended the same way, deleted before it could send. I didn't want apologies spoken only because they'd been caught. I wanted clarity. And to get that, I knew I needed to wait. My family never went long without asking for help. There was always a favor, a bill a weekend plan that required my approval. If I stayed quiet long enough, the next request would come. I started keeping notes in a small ledger I used for budgeting. Every time I remembered a wire transfer, a payment, or a favor, I wrote it down. The list filled pages. There was the $10,000 I'd lent my parents when their water heater failed, the $5,000 I'd covered when Chloe lost her job for 2 months, the endless smaller transfers to Donna for one emergency after another. Tens of thousands over the years. Seeing it on paper made it undeniable. When my mother called that Wednesday, her voice sounded warm, practiced, easy. "Sweetheart, how are you?" "We haven't heard from you since the party." I told her I'd been busy with work. She launched into small talk about her book club, about how Robert's back was acting up again. I asked how Chloe was doing, and she laughed. "Still glowing, that girl. Evan can't take his eyes off her." I made the right noises, said the right things. The entire time my hand rested on the ledger beside me. By the end of the call, she was humming. "We're thinking of coming into the city soon, maybe have dinner." "That sounds nice," I said, and we hung up. The silence that followed felt cleaner than it had in weeks. They still believed nothing had changed. It was the first time in years that I realized I didn't have to react. I could plan. That plan formed slowly. Each time someone called, I practiced the same calm tone. I laughed when they did, offered congratulations when they mentioned Chloe's upcoming wedding, and said yes when they asked small favors. I wanted them to keep their rhythm, to keep believing I was the same reliable Laura who never said no. The waiting became its own kind of focus. It didn't take long. 2 weeks later, my mother's name appeared on my phone again, her voice bright and bubbling with excitement. "Laura, you won't believe it." Evan proposed. "The ring is stunning. We're so thrilled for them." I smiled into the phone. "That's wonderful news, Mom." She exhaled, already moving ahead. "We've been talking, and we all agree the perfect place for an engagement party is your country house. It's so lovely, and it would mean so much to Chloe." I let the pause hang. "Of course," I said. "The house is always available for family." She rushed on, her tone softening. "There's just one small thing. We want to make this special, real catering music flowers, but we're a little tight on funds right now. We'd only need a bit to cover it. 5,000 should do it." The number landed exactly as I expected. I kept my voice steady. "That's quite a bit, Mom." She sighed, the kind of sigh that carried a lifetime of practiced guilt. "You make good money, sweetheart, and Chloe only gets engaged once. We just want it to be perfect for her." I let the silence linger before I answered. "I wish I could help, but things are tight right now. Maybe next month." Her voice faltered, then recovered. "Well, maybe your dad and I and Chloe and Evan could pay up front. You can pay us back when you can." There it was, the same trap wrapped in new ribbon. "That sounds fair," I said smoothly. "Go ahead with your plans. I'll reimburse you later." Her relief came out in a laugh. "You're an angel, Laura. Everyone will be so happy." When we hung up, I looked out the window and saw the city reflected back at me, steady, indifferent, waiting. They thought they'd won again. I wrote a single line in my ledger beneath the list of debts: engagement party, 5,000 pending. That weekend I called the locksmith named Carl, who had helped me replace locks at the office once. He promised to meet me at the country house the night before the party. "We'll get everything rekeyed," he said. I thanked him and circled the date on my calendar. The plan was simple now. I would give them the party they thought they deserved, only not in the way they expected. The following Friday, I drove out after work. The sun had set by the time I reached the house, and the driveway was already lined with cars. Through the windows, I saw white streamers twisting along the porch rails, soft lights strung through the hedges, and a long table dressed in linen. It was beautiful, deliberate, and completely false. I parked around the side away from view. When Carl arrived, I guided him quietly through the doors. Within an hour, every lock had been replaced. When he handed me the new keys, I felt the weight of them settle in my palm. I thanked him and walked him to his truck. Then, one by one, I began removing the decorations. The ribbons, the balloons, the paper lanterns, they all went into large black bags. By midnight, the yard was bare again. I left the bags near the porch where they couldn't miss them in the morning. Before I drove back to the city, I sent my mother a short message. Not feeling well. Don't want to get anyone sick. Hope the party goes smoothly. Her reply came minutes later. That's fine. Feel better. No concern, no questions, just relief that I wouldn't be there. I placed my phone face down on the passenger seat and started the car. The road stretched ahead quiet and empty, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was driving away from something. I was driving toward it. The morning would bring noise, confusion, and questions, but tonight belonged to the silence before they found out the truth. Saturday morning came clear and bright, the kind of late summer morning when sunlight has a golden weight to it. I woke with an unusual calm. My phone sat silent on the nightstand for a while, and I drank my coffee slowly, waiting for the inevitable vibration. It didn't take long. Around 11, a string of texts lit up the screen, first from my mother, then Chloe, then my father. We're here, but the keys don't work. Did you change something? I set the cup down and read the words twice before turning the phone face down. The clock ticked softly against the quiet. By noon, the calls began. I let each one ring until it stopped. When the third round came, I answered. My mother's voice hit like the crack of a whip. Laura, thank God. We're all standing outside like fools. None of the keys fit. What on earth happened? I took a slow breath and said evenly, Nothing's wrong with the locks. I just had them changed yesterday. Silence stretched so long I could hear the faint rustle of wind on her end. You changed the locks? She stammered. Why would you do that? I leaned back in my chair, the phone warm against my ear. Because it's my property, Mom, and I thought it was time to protect it, especially after hearing what you all really think of me. Her voice faltered. What do you mean? We would never. I didn't let her finish. Don't lie. I heard every word. That night a few weeks ago when you called me naive and toasted to having a family bank. Dad bragged about tricking me into keeping this house. Chloe joked about scamming me for rent. Aunt Donna redecorated her living room with my money, and Uncle Frank bought himself a new toy. I heard it all. On the other end, I could hear the muffled shuffle of movement, the murmured voices trying to piece together what had just unraveled. My mother's tone softened into its usual sweetness. Oh, honey, that was just talk. You misunderstood. We were only joking around. I felt a slow, steady clarity settle inside me. You think mocking me in front of everyone is a joke, raising a glass to how easy I am to use? You all laughed about taking from me, and now you're surprised the door won't open. Someone else's voice broke in, Chloe, high and panicked. Laura, you're ruining everything. The guests are arriving, the caterer's here, and you've locked us out. This is insane. I could almost see her standing on the porch in some pale dress, hands on her hips, eyes darting between my parents and Evan. Funny, I said quietly. I thought I was the fool. This is my engagement party, she snapped. You can't do this. I kept my tone level. I already took down the decorations you left. They're in garbage bags by the porch. You can pick them up whenever you leave. A sharp intake of breath filled the line. You're being ridiculous, she said, her voice trembling between anger and disbelief. If you don't open this door, we'll call a locksmith or break it down. I let a small pause stretch before answering. No, you won't. There are cameras on every entrance and a live alarm system. The second you touch the door, the police will be on their way. So go ahead, Chloe. Try it. In the background, my father's voice rumbled low, saying something I couldn't make out. My mother came back on the line, her tone now pleading. Laura, please. Let's talk like adults. Don't do something you'll regret. We can fix this. There's nothing to fix, I said. You spent money you didn't have, expecting I'd pay for it. You turned me into a running joke, and I'm done pretending not to see it. Take your guests and leave my property. Her composure cracked. We spent $5,000, Laura. You owe us. I almost laughed. I owe you nothing. That was your gamble and it didn't pay off. The silence that followed was heavy. When my mother finally spoke, her voice had dropped to a whisper. You don't mean this. You can't just turn your back on us. We're your family. Exactly, I said softly. And that makes it worse. I hung up before she could say another word. For a few minutes, I sat staring at the phone. Then I opened the security app and watched the camera feed. The front lawn looked like a scene from a play gone wrong, clusters of people in dress clothes shifting from foot to foot, the caterer standing awkwardly beside a van, my mother pacing near the porch. My father had his arms crossed, expression hard and unreadable. Chloe was crying, her hand pressed to her face while Evan tried to comfort her. Aunt Donna spoke to anyone who would listen, her gestures sharp and theatrical. It was chaos, but not mine anymore. They stayed for nearly an hour. Cars began to pull away one by one. Eventually, the yard was empty except for a few forgotten balloons and the trash bags by the porch. The camera feed flickered once, then went still. I closed the app and exhaled. The next morning, I woke to pounding at my apartment door. I checked the peephole and saw them, my parents and Chloe, crowded together in the hallway, faces drawn tight. I opened the door just enough to lean against the frame. My father pushed past before I could speak, followed by my mother and Chloe. "We need to talk," he said, voice clipped. "You embarrassed us yesterday. You made a scene in front of everyone." Chloe's eyes were red, her words tumbling out in gasps. "You ruined my engagement party. Do you even understand what you've done?" I crossed my arms. "I stopped you from using me again." "You owe us $5,000, she shouted. "We already paid for the food, the band. Everything. You promised to pay us back." "I never promised," I said quietly. "I said you could go ahead and plan and I'd reimburse you when I could. You assumed I meant yes. That was your choice." My mother stepped forward, her voice high and trembling. "Laura, this isn't how family treats each other. After all we've done for you, after all the support we've given." I met her eyes. "Support. You manipulated me into keeping a house I didn't even want. You called me naive, mocked me behind my back, and took thousands without a second thought. What kind of support is that?" For a moment no one spoke. Then my mother's shoulders slumped. "You set us up," she said softly. "You wanted this to happen. I didn't deny it. I wanted you to see who I really am, the person you thought was too soft to fight back. You called me naive. Turns out I was just patient." My father's hand slammed against the counter, the sound sharp. "Until you apologize and pay us back, we're done. Don't come around. Don't call. You're not welcome at family events." I smiled faintly. "That makes things simpler." Chloe's voice cracked as she tried one last time. "Laura, you're my sister. You can't just shut us out." "You already did that," I said, "the night you laughed about stealing from me." Tears rolled down her cheeks. I walked to the door, opened it wide, and stepped aside. "You can go now," my father muttered under his breath as he stormed out. My mother followed, her face pale, her eyes darting toward mine but never meeting them. Chloe hesitated at the threshold, whispering, "I didn't mean for it to go that far." I said nothing. She left. When the door clicked shut, the apartment went still. I leaned against the frame, breathing in the quiet. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel guilty. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was steady, like standing on solid ground after years of sinking sand. I didn't know what came next, not exactly. But I knew I wouldn't be answering any more calls that began with "Sweetheart, can you help us?" That part of my life had ended on that porch with a handful of keys and a door that finally stayed closed. Outside, the day had begun to cool, and the first signs of fall brushed the trees. I watched the leaves shift in the wind and knew that whatever came next, it would be mine to build quietly, carefully, without apology. And somewhere out there, my family was learning what it felt like to stand outside a locked door, wondering how they'd lost the key. That night, after the door shut behind my family, the quiet stretched through the apartment like something new and alive. For years, silence had felt heavy, a space waiting to be filled by someone else's needs. Now it settled clean, still, and honest. I stood in the middle of my living room for a long time, breathing it in. My phone lay face down on the counter, but I didn't touch it. Whatever messages might come could wait. For once, there was no one left to answer. The next morning, I opened the blinds to a soft gray sky. Rain had fallen overnight, the streets below glistening in the early light. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and let the steam rise between my hands. Every sound felt sharper. The tick of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the quiet creak of the chair when I shifted my weight. It was the first weekend in years that didn't belong to anyone but me. I didn't drive to the country house. I didn't cook or clean for a crowd. I didn't open my wallet at the sound of a story meant to pull at my heart. I just stayed still. By Monday, the texts began again, this time less frantic, but no softer. Chloe started with a single line, "You've gone too far." A few hours later came another from my mother. "We need to talk about what you did." I didn't reply. 2 days after that, my father sent a message that simply read, "You've embarrassed us all." I deleted them one by one. The week passed quietly, each day lighter than the one before. At work, I found myself focusing in a way I hadn't in years. Projects that used to drain me now felt manageable. I stopped staying late to distract myself. I came home on time, cooked for one, and rediscovered the small rhythm of my own company. Still late at night, there were moments when the old ache crept back, the memory of my mother's voice, the sound of laughter in that house, the weight of how deeply I'd wanted to belong. Those moments didn't linger. They passed like weather. A week later, an email from my real estate agent reminded me about the house's annual property tax review. I stared at the number for a long time, then called her. "What's the short-term rental market like out there these days?" I asked. She hesitated, surprised by the question, then said it was strong, steady bookings, good rates, especially for homes with charm and space. By the end of the call, she promised to send over paperwork for a property management contract. When we hung up, I looked around my apartment and felt something shift. The house that had once drained me might finally start giving something back. That weekend I drove out alone. The drive was quiet, the road familiar. When I pulled into the gravel driveway, the house stood exactly as I'd left it, clean, bare, waiting. The air still smelled faintly of the pine cleaner I'd used weeks earlier. I unlocked the door and walked through each room, checking the windows, opening the curtains, letting the light in. It felt different now, lighter somehow, as if the walls had been holding their breath too. I took photographs of the rooms and the yard, the porch swing, the wide kitchen window that overlooked the trees. I sent them to the agency that afternoon. Within a few weeks, they listed the property as a short-term rental. The first booking came almost immediately, a family from out of state looking for a quiet weekend getaway. When the confirmation email arrived, I smiled. For once, the house would host people who paid to be there. The first few months went better than I could have imagined. The agency handled everything: the guests, the cleaning, the maintenance. The income covered most of my apartment mortgage, with enough left to start rebuilding the savings I'd drained helping my family. Each week I'd receive a message after checkout: "Wonderful stay. Beautiful home. Hope to return." It was strange seeing strangers appreciate a place my own family had taken for granted. There was something healing in that. One evening, about 2 months into the rental, my phone buzzed with a name I hadn't seen in weeks: my mother. I hesitated, then let it go to voicemail. A few minutes later, the notification appeared. Her voice was careful, almost rehearsed. "Laura, it's your mother. We just wanted to check in. Chloe's been... well, things have been stressful with the wedding plans. She misses you. We all do. Maybe we can start fresh." The line went quiet for a moment, then ended with a sigh. I didn't call back. Later that night, I scrolled through social media and saw a post from Chloe, her engagement photos with Evan taken in a park near their apartment. The caption read, "Can't wait to spend forever with my best friend." I stared at it for a while, then closed the app. There was no anger left in me, just a quiet understanding that I didn't need to be part of their forever. A few weeks later, a mutual acquaintance from town mentioned in passing that Chloe and Evan had married in a small church ceremony. No invitations, sent no announcements, just a handful of photos shared online. I felt an unexpected calm when I heard it. There was no sadness, no resentment, just relief that their story no longer required my funding or approval. For the first time, I wasn't expected to save the day or foot the bill. As autumn settled in, the house continued to thrive as a rental. The guests treated it with care, leaving notes on the kitchen counter about their visits. One family wrote, "Thank you for sharing your home. It felt like peace." Reading that line, I realized how far the place had come from chaos to calm, from a constant burden to a space filled with gratitude. I had done that, quietly, without anyone's permission. My parents reached out a few more times after the wedding, small gestures dressed as olive branches. My father emailed a short apology, 3 lines polite but hollow. My mother sent a message through a mutual friend asking if we could meet to talk things through. I didn't respond to either. The door had already closed, and I had no reason to unlock it again. The months that followed felt steady. I filled my weekends with simple things: farmers markets, long walks, evenings spent reading on the couch. Friends from work invited me out more often, and I said yes. Somewhere along the way, I noticed the quiet didn't feel empty anymore. It felt earned. One cold Saturday morning in December, I drove out to the country house for the first time since the rental began. The last guests had checked out early, and I wanted to see it with my own eyes. The yard was covered in frost, the trees bare, the porch light glowing softly against the gray sky. Inside, everything was spotless. A folded note sat on the counter left by the last visitors. "We loved our stay. Thank you for the warmth this home carries." I ran my hand along the smooth edge of the counter and smiled. Standing there, I realized the house had come full circle. It had once been the weight that tied me to everyone else's expectations, the proof that I would always say yes. Now it was simply mine, quiet, strong, and finally giving something back. When I locked the door behind me, the sound was soft but certain. I slipped the key into my pocket, started the car, and drove toward the city. The sky was clearing as I reached the main road. A long streak of sunlight broke through the clouds, and for the first time in years I didn't look back. Ahead of me stretched something that felt wide open, unwritten but steady. I didn't know what the next chapter would bring, but for once it would be mine alone. And somewhere behind me, a house that had carried years of noise now stood quiet, waiting for the next guests to walk through the door. Winter passed into spring with a quiet steadiness I hadn't felt in years. The air outside the office softened, the days stretched longer, and my life settled into a rhythm that was mine alone. I no longer checked my phone out of habit, waiting for the next favor or guilt-soaked call. Each morning started with coffee, each evening ended with peace. The distance from my family grew without effort. No dramatic breaks, no fiery words, just silence, the kind that builds walls on its own. It had been nearly 3 months since I'd last heard from any of them when I opened my mailbox one Thursday evening and found a thick ivory envelope. My name was written across it in my mother's looping script. I didn't have to open it to know what it was. Still, I slit the edge with my thumb and slid out a folded card bordered in gold. "Chloe and Evan Parker request the honor of your presence at their wedding celebration." Below it in smaller script were the words, "Private ceremony completed. Reception to follow." The postmark was dated 3 weeks earlier. I set the invitation on the counter and stared at it under the kitchen light. There was no note, no explanation, no signature, just a formality mailed like an afterthought. For a long time, I stood there without moving, the clock ticking softly in the background. Then I placed it back in the envelope and dropped it in the trash. That weekend, I drove to the country house to check on the property. The snow had melted into small rivers that ran along the driveway, and the grass was still patchy and brown from winter. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, a sure sign the management company had kept up with their work. On the counter, a small stack of guest notes waited, each one thanking me for a lovely stay. I flipped through them slowly, the handwriting different on every card, but the words all familiar: peaceful, comfortable, perfect, getaway. The rental income had grown stronger than I'd expected. By the end of each month, it not only covered the mortgage, but left enough to build savings again. I'd started a travel fund, something I hadn't dared to consider in years. I even looked at maps some nights, tracing routes I might take once summer came. The idea of going somewhere simply because I wanted to felt like a quiet rebellion against the life I'd lived before. A few days later, an email arrived from my Aunt Donna. The subject line read, Family matters. I almost deleted it without opening, but curiosity stopped me. The message was short. Your mother isn't doing well. She's worried sick about you. None of us understand why you've turned your back. You should make things right before it's too late. There was no mention of how I'd been treated, no acknowledgement of what had led to the silence, just the same old guilt wrapped in polite phrasing. I closed the email and moved it to a separate folder marked Save for Later. I didn't plan to read it again, but I couldn't quite delete it either. By early April, my work schedule lightened, and I began spending weekends out at the house again. Without the noise of family gatherings, the place felt larger, calmer. I replaced a few worn chairs, hung new curtains, and planted hydrangeas by the porch. The house had always been beautiful, but now it felt like something alive again. Guests treated it with care, leaving the rooms as neat as they found them, sometimes tidier. One evening, while reviewing upcoming bookings, I noticed a familiar name among the inquiries. It was faintly surreal Margaret Bennett one-night stay request. My mother. I sat back in my chair, the cursor blinking beside her name. There was no message attached, just the automated note from the booking site. Requested dates May 14th, 15. Purpose of stay family visit. I stared at the screen for a long time. My first thought was that it must be a mistake, that she'd clicked the wrong property. But the address was unmistakable. My house. The same one she'd once called our family retreat. I didn't accept the reservation, but I didn't decline it right away either. A few hours later, a message came through the site. Laura, it's Mom. Please don't ignore this. I just want to see you and talk face to face. It's been long enough. I read it twice, then closed my laptop. That night, I didn't sleep well. The next morning, I logged in again and clicked Decline Request. A week passed without another message. Then, on a quiet Sunday morning, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but something told me to answer. Laura, it's me. My mother's voice came through softer than I remembered. I know you saw my message. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. The word hung there, uncertain. I waited, but she didn't continue. What exactly are you sorry for? I asked. She hesitated, then said, for how things turned out, for everything that's happened. Your sister's been so upset. Your father, too. We all just want things back the way they were. I closed my eyes, letting her words settle. The way they were, I repeated quietly. You mean when I paid for everything and pretended not to notice the jokes? That's not fair, she said quickly. We never meant to hurt you. But you did, I said. And not just once. You built a life on it. She sighed, the kind that carried years of practiced sadness. Families fight, Laura, but they forgive too. I'm still your mother. I looked out the window. The city below glowed in early sunlight, clean and untouchable. You are, I said softly, but that doesn't mean I owe you the version of me you preferred. For a long time, neither of us spoke. When she finally did, her voice trembled. If you ever change your mind, the door's open. I know, I said, but mine isn't. Then I ended the call. Afterward, I sat by the window for a while, watching a few clouds drift past the skyline. My hands shook, but not from anger, more from the strange finality of it all. The conversation hadn't felt like victory. It had felt like closing a book that had been left open for too long. Weeks later, as spring slipped into early summer, I heard through a coworker who still followed Chloe online that she and Evan had moved into a small apartment across town. The photos showed them smiling on a modest balcony, the caption cheerful. New beginnings. I didn't click through the album. I didn't need to. The distance between us had grown wide enough to feel permanent, and for once I didn't feel the need to cross it. One Friday evening, I drove back to the country house to drop off a new welcome binder for guests. The sun hung low over the trees, painting the yard in soft gold. As I walked the perimeter, I noticed something small near the front step, a folded note tucked beneath the doormat. My name was written across it in my mother's handwriting. I looked around. The road was empty, the air still. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper. We stopped by today. The house looks beautiful. You've done a wonderful job. We're proud of you. Love, Mom and Dad. The paper trembled slightly in my hand. I folded it, once placed it on the entry table, and left it there. I didn't call, and I didn't write back. Some bridges aren't burned, they're just quietly left behind. That night I sat on the porch with a cup of tea as the sky deepened into violet. Fireflies rose from the grass, drifting through the warm air. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. I thought about all the nights that house had held chaotic ones, lonely ones, now peaceful ones. It felt like the world had finally turned quiet enough to hear myself breathe. The porch light flickered, catching the glint of the keys hanging on a hook beside the door. I watched them sway gently, the same ones I'd held months earlier when everything changed. The locks had kept out more than just intruders. They'd given me space to rebuild what I'd almost lost. And as the last trace of daylight slipped behind the trees, I realized that the hardest part hadn't been shutting the door. It had been learning not to open it again. The night settled fully, then calm and certain, carrying me toward whatever waited next. Summer arrived like a long exhale. The air grew heavy with heat, and the city shimmered beneath it. My life had steadied into something simple, a clean pattern of work, rest, and quiet. The country house continued to bring in steady income, and I had grown used to checking the guest calendar instead of my family's messages. It felt good to open my inbox and see nothing but confirmations receipts and kind reviews. The world had stopped asking for more than I could give. By early July, the last trace of the old chaos had faded. I hadn't heard from my mother or father in weeks, and Chloe had gone silent since her wedding. It was as if we all had agreed without saying a word to let the distance hold. Then one afternoon, a message appeared on my phone, a name I hadn't seen in months. Laura Bennett. My thumb hovered over the screen for a moment before I opened it. Laura, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but please read this. I made a mess of things, and I can't stop thinking about how I hurt you. I'd like to see you just once, no parents, no drama. Please. I sat with the message for a while. The words were careful, not defensive. I typed a reply before I could overthink it. I'm free Saturday morning, coffee at Miller's Deli on Main. Her response came a few minutes later. I'll be there. Thank you. Saturday came bright and humid. When I walked into the cafe, the scent of roasted beans and cinnamon bread filled the air. Chloe was already there, sitting by the window. She looked smaller somehow, her hair pulled back, her shoulders drawn in. When she saw me, her eyes widened with relief. You came, she said softly. I said I would. We ordered coffee and sat across from each other, the silence stretching longer than either of us seemed prepared for. Finally, she spoke. I don't know how to start. I guess I just need to tell you I'm sorry. I looked at her hands folded around the cup. For what exactly? Her throat worked as she swallowed. For being cruel. For joining in that night at the house. I laughed because everyone else did, and it was easier than standing up for you. You've always been the one who gave, and I took advantage of that. We all did. I let her words settle before answering. You did more than take advantage, Chloe. You made me believe I was loved only when I was useful. Her eyes filled quickly, her voice breaking as she said, You didn't deserve that. I was jealous. You had your career, your independence, and I thought if I kept you close, some of that strength might rub off on me. Instead, I made you the punchline. The cafe was quiet, except for the sound of cups clinking and the low hum of conversation. I studied her face, the same soft features I'd grown up seeing across the dinner table now, shadowed by something unfamiliar. Regret, maybe, or growing up. What do you want from me, Chloe? I asked gently. Not money, she said quickly. Not anything like that. I just want to make things right. Evan and we're trying to do things on our own now. I finally understand what it's like to struggle and not have anyone to fall back on. It made me think of you. I leaned back in my chair. Struggle has a way of showing you who you are, I said. She nodded, wiping her eyes. Mom and Dad don't understand why you won't talk to them. They think time will fix everything, but I know better. You don't forget words like the ones we said. I didn't answer right away. Outside the window, a breeze caught the edge of the cafe awning, and a pair of wind chimes above the door clinked softly. I thought of all the years I'd spent trying to keep peace at my own expense, how deeply I'd believed family loyalty was worth any cost. Now sitting across from the sister who had once led the laughter, I felt something lighter, clarity, not bitterness. "I don't hate you," I said finally. "But forgiveness doesn't mean we go back to what we were. It means we start with truth and see what's left." Her shoulders sagged in relief. "That's all I'm asking." We talked for almost an hour. She told me about her new job at a local boutique, about how she and Evan were saving for their own home. I listened without interrupting, letting her speak, until the tightness in her voice eased. When we stood to leave, she hesitated before reaching out. "Can I hug you?" I nodded. The embrace was brief but real. As she pulled back, she whispered, "You always were the strong one. I just didn't see it before." After she left, I stayed at the table a few minutes longer, finishing my coffee. The sunlight moved across the floor, touching the edges of the chair where she had sat. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel weighed down by what we'd lost. It felt like something had finally been set down between us, something that didn't need to be picked up again. That afternoon, I drove out to the country house. The hydrangeas had begun to bloom, their pale blue petals bright against the green yard. I unlocked the door, opened the windows, and let the air sweep through. The house smelled like wood and summer. I sat on the porch steps with a glass of lemonade, listening to the wind move through the trees. Around sunset, my phone buzzed with a notification from the rental app. A new guest had left a review. 5 stars. Beautiful home, peaceful stay. You can feel the care in every corner. I smiled and set the phone aside. The care they felt had come hard-earned, carved from years of giving too much and finally learning how to keep enough for myself. As the sky darkened, I thought about my family, the version of them that still lingered in old habits, and the version that might one day reach for better. Maybe Chloe would hold on to what she'd learned. Maybe she wouldn't. Either way, I was no longer the one responsible for holding us all together. When I finally stood to go inside, the porch light flickered on automatically, bathing the steps in a soft glow. I looked back once at the path leading down toward the road, remembering how it had once filled with cars and laughter that wasn't mine. Now it was quiet, peaceful, and completely still. I closed the door behind me and turned the key, feeling the click echo through the empty rooms. It wasn't the sound of shutting anyone out. It was the sound of knowing I could choose who to let in. Later that night, I sat by the window with a blanket over my shoulders, the moon hanging low above the trees. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called again, the same sound I'd heard the night I first locked them all out. The echo no longer carried pain. It carried closure. The next morning, as the first light broke through the curtains, I realized the truth I'd been circling for months. Justice hadn't come through confrontation or revenge. It had come through peace, steady quiet, and completely my own, and though my family might never understand that I did. When I left the house later that day, I locked the door behind me and slipped the key into my pocket. It felt light this time, not like an anchor, but a reminder of everything I'd taken back and everything still waiting ahead. By the time autumn rolled around again, the air had turned crisp and familiar. Mornings carried that faint scent of wood smoke, and evenings came earlier each day. I'd spent the summer rebuilding the quiet corners of my life, and for the first time, peace didn't feel like something borrowed. It felt like something I had earned. The country house still stood steady on its patch of land, framed by the turning leaves. Guests came and went with soft footprints and kind words, leaving notes that I sometimes reread on slow afternoons. Each message carried the same theme: gratitude, serenity, a sense of comfort. It always made me smile. That house had once drained every ounce of my energy, but now it sustained me. It no longer belonged to anyone's expectation. It was just mine. One Saturday morning in early October, I returned to the property for maintenance before the next guests arrived. The drive was long, but easy. The road lined with gold and rust-colored trees. When I pulled into the gravel driveway, the light hit the windows in a way that made them gleam. I stepped out of the car, breathing in the cool air. There was no noise, no crowd, no chaos, only birdsong and wind moving through the leaves. Inside, everything was just as it should be. The curtains swayed gently with the draft, and the kitchen smelled faintly of cedar. On the counter sat the old note my parents had left months earlier, the one that said they were proud of me. I hadn't moved it. I didn't need to. It wasn't forgiveness I wanted from them anymore, just space. And now, standing there in the calm of my own creation, I realized I had it. I spent most of the day cleaning, polishing, and watering the plants by the porch. In the quiet rhythm of work, I thought about how much had changed in a single year. Back then, I couldn't imagine saying no to my family without guilt. I couldn't picture a life that wasn't built around pleasing someone else. But slowly, choice by choice, I'd drawn the lines that saved me. As the afternoon light softened, I sat on the steps with a cup of tea. The wind carried the scent of pine and distant rain. I found myself thinking about Chloe, about that morning in the cafe. Her apology, the way her hands trembled when she spoke. We hadn't talked again since then, but there was no bitterness in the distance. Sometimes love is better quiet, stretched across understanding, instead of constant noise. The truth is, justice didn't come the way I once imagined it would. It wasn't in the moment I locked them out, or when the silence finally held. Justice came slower, smaller, through peace, through ownership, through the life I built when no one else was watching. The balance was restored not by revenge, but by recovery. I looked out toward the fields as the sun began to dip. Shadows stretched across the grass, long and soft. The porch creaked under my feet, and the old swing swayed slightly in the wind. For years I thought strength meant holding everyone together even when it broke me. Now I knew it meant letting go. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is walk away and keep walking until the air feels clean again. By the time the sky turned dusky pink, I gathered my things and prepared to leave. The lights inside glowed warm through the windows, and for a brief second I saw my reflection staring back at me, calm, older, but whole. I locked the door and slid the key into my pocket. It didn't feel heavy anymore. Driving back toward the city, I rolled the windows down and let the wind rush in. The trees blurred into shades of amber and copper, and the horizon stretched wide and forgiving. There were no ghosts chasing me down that road, no voices demanding more than I could give. Only quiet and the steady beat of my heart against the hum of the tires. I used to think closure meant reconciliation, that to move forward, everyone had to meet in the middle. But life taught me something gentler. Sometimes closure is just peace that no one else gets to disturb. It's understanding your worth even when others refuse to see it. It's choosing yourself without apology. When I reached the city, the streetlights had already flickered on. I parked by my building and stood for a moment looking up at the windows glowing softly above. My life was smaller now, but it was honest. Every choice had led me here to this quiet balance between independence and forgiveness. I went inside, set down my keys, and poured a glass of water. Outside, traffic moved like a slow current. The night felt wide open. Somewhere in that stillness, I knew I had finally come full circle, not back to who I was before, but to who I was meant to become. Sometimes the hardest justice isn't in proving others wrong. It's in living well enough that you no longer need to. If you've ever had to rebuild your peace after someone took advantage of your kindness, I hope this story stays with you. And if it did take a moment to share it, or simply reflect on your own strength, you might find, like I did, that peace was waiting for you all along, just on the other side of enough.